Okay, picture this. A monarch who preferred the company of opera phantoms to his own generals. A king who literally transformed rugged mountains into fairy tale landscapes, all while the world around him was whispering that he'd gone completely insane. This is the tragic and utterly fascinating story of King Ludwig II of Bavaria. This quote it nails it. It perfectly captures the paradox of his life. His greatest passion, this incredible, boundless imagination, was also the very thing that led to his ruin. It wasn't some foreign army that brought him down, but the sheer weight of his own dreams. And that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? Was Ludwig II truly insane, a danger to his own kingdom? Or was he this brilliant, sensitive artist who was just born into the wrong role at the absolute wrong time? We're going to dive into his story, and you can decide for yourself. To really get what happened to him in the end, we've got to go back to the beginning. Back to a young man who found himself on a throne, but whose heart was, well, somewhere else entirely. So Ludwig was born into this super strict world of 19th century royalty, and from a young age, he felt like a total outsider in his own family. Then, bam, at just 18 years old, he's crowned king. He's handsome, he's full of potential. But what's his first big act? Not a military campaign, not a political treaty. Nope, he summons his hero, the composer Richard Wagner, and basically dedicates his reign to being his patron. And you can see right away, there's this huge clash. A typical king was supposed to be all about politics and military power. But Ludwig, his mind was completely consumed by art, by architecture, and by bringing Wagner's epic German myths to life. For him, the opera house was way, way more important than the halls of government. So, since he was so uncomfortable with his actual royal duties, Ludwig started to do something, well, extraordinary. He started using the kingdom's money to build a private world just for himself, pulling away from public life and constructing these incredible physical versions of his own imagination. And of course, there's his most famous creation, Neuschwanstein. This place wasn't built to be a seat of power or to house a royal court. Not at all. It was designed as a private stage, a medieval fantasy perched on a cliffside, acting as a literal stone barrier between him and the noisy, demanding world outside. And the more he pulled away, the more eccentric his habits got. He literally became a king of the night, flipping his schedule completely to sleep during the day. He'd take these fantastical sleigh rides all alone through the moonlit forests, finding this sense of freedom only when the world that judged him was sound asleep. And then you've got Linderhof, another one of his palaces. Here he built this unbelievable artificial cave, complete with a lake and some of the earliest electric lighting in the world. He'd be rowed around in a golden, shell-shaped boat, just living out scenes from Wagner's operas, all by himself. It was his own private, perfectly controlled little universe. Okay, but here's the thing. While Ludwig is off living in his fantasy world, a very harsh reality is catching up with him. You see, you can't build dream castles with real money, and his infinite imagination was about to slam right into the very finite budget of the Bavarian state. I mean, Ludwig completely ignored his duties as king. He had absolutely no time for governance. He actually described the official paperwork he was supposed to be looking at as a suffocating metal box. He'd much rather spend the kingdom's money on his building projects, and he was draining the treasury fast. And this is a really key point. His spending and his neglect didn't just cause a financial mess. They made him powerful enemies. His own ministers started to see him as a real threat to the country's stability, and they began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, they needed to get rid of him to save the state. So all this discontent just keeps building and building until it finally explodes into the final dramatic act of his reign. With the government totally united against him, a swift and brutal plot was hatched to get the fairytale king off his throne for good. Now, before we see exactly how they did it, it's really important to understand this term, Kafkaesque. It basically describes a nightmarish situation where you're trapped in a system that makes no sense, you're facing charges you can't fight, and you're being judged by forces you can't even see. And that is exactly what happened to King Ludwig. His downfall happened so fast, it's honestly shocking. First, the ministers finalize their plan. Second, they get a medical report from a group of doctors who declare him insane, get this, without ever meeting him or examining him. And just like that, based on a bunch of secondhand stories, he was officially dethroned and made a prisoner in his own home. But that's not even the end of the story. Just 3 days after being locked up, Ludwig's life came to a sudden, violent, and deeply mysterious end. On the evening of June 13th, Ludwig went for a walk with his doctor, the very same guy who had signed off on his insanity diagnosis. Hours later, both of them were found dead, floating in the shallow waters of the lake right near the castle. The official story was suicide by drowning, but so many things just didn't add up. Why was his doctor also dead? Why were there signs of a struggle? With absolutely no witnesses and no real evidence, the questions are still hanging there today. Was he murdered trying to escape? Did he pull his doctor into the water with him? We'll probably never know for sure. And this is where we get to the final, and honestly, the most mind-blowing irony of Ludwig's entire life. The man who was declared unfit to rule, whose dreams were laughed off as madness, would end up leaving the most powerful and enduring legacy of them all. I mean, it is the ultimate reversal of fortune. In his own lifetime, he was judged a total failure who almost bankrupted his country. Today, he is Bavaria's most famous icon. Those very castles that caused all the debt now bring in huge amounts of money for the state. His voice, which was silenced and dishonored back in 1886, is now, in a way, heard by the millions of people who visit his creations every single year. Ultimately, Ludwig's story kind of shows us that beauty can be its own form of resistance. Yeah, his kingdom was taken away from him, but his inner world, that remained his. As this quote suggests, your imagination can be a final refuge, a territory that no outside force can ever truly conquer. So, we end right where we began. Now that you've heard the whole story, what do you think? Was he a self-indulgent madman who ran away from his duties? Or was he a true artist, a dreamer whose vision was just too big, too grand for the rigid political world he happened to be born into? The answer, a lot like the king himself, remains a beautiful and tragic mystery.